kind of lonely up here. But we have the honor today, honestly, to have two really distinguished technologists with us here to talk about their business and really the way in which they frame their solutions. Key focal point for what we'll be talking about today is really when is cloud right and what are the dynamics that someone would think through when adopting cloud or comparing cloud to their own in-house infrastructure. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Akhil and John. And Akhil joins us today from Dropbox. Akhil Gupta, you want to introduce yourself and kind of describe the role?
Yes, first of all, thanks QCT and Mike for giving us an opportunity to talk with all of you. I'm the VP of Engineering at Dropbox, responsible for all of infrastructure, the backend services, physical data centers. Been at Dropbox for about 4 years now, and really excited to come here.
Cool. And John Galen from Pinterest now, although I met you quite a while back at a different company, so you want to give us a brief intro?
Yeah, so my name is John Galen. I've been around for a little while, so I've been at Pinterest since March actually, but my background is I came from Alta Vista, worked at Yahoo. My latest endeavor before this was the Rubicon project, which is a big advertising exchange, amongst other things. So, but yeah, I've built a lot of systems.
So, with all that said, honestly, I'd kind of like to get a peek into the infrastructure that both of your current shops run.
Yeah.
I think that'll give us the starting point to kind of look down and see the transitions that we've gone through. So, knowing a little bit about kind of Akhil, what you've gone through there over the past, maybe give us a peek all the way back to kind of where things started out and then some transitions that led you to where you are today.
Sure. So I think Dropbox was probably a hybrid infrastructure before the term hybrid infrastructure came into vogue. So when Dropbox started, it started by leveraging Amazon, which was not as mature service as you may think of it right now, using S3 to store the block data of the files, but then maintaining their own databases and compute in hosted services. And over the years, we moved from managed services into our own data centers and building a supply chain and hardware team. And the last couple of years, we've also taken the effort to migrate more than 500 petabytes of our block data, which was being stored in S3, into our own internal in-house infrastructure. So at this point, I think we have majority of our infrastructure is in-house. We do use Amazon, AWS specifically, and plan to continue using it in areas where we think it will add value. And that's something that our philosophy is always aligned with what you saw in the conference around hybrid infrastructure is the future, and everyone has to think about when to use private cloud and when to use public cloud.
Excellent. We'll really want to dig in on a couple of those topics, but before we get started, John, kind of given your background, I think we could talk about a lot of broad things, but maybe starting point is, what does Pinterest look like today? What is your infrastructure composed of?
So Pinterest is 100% cloud, and you know, somebody gave me the mic. I can't resist talking about some of the older things too. So you know, when I first installed my first search engine back at Alta Vista, you know, it was all GS160s, the big closet boxes with you know, large FDDI disk subsystems, and you know, you put these things together and it comes up, you know, needs to upgrade firmware, right? And you know, you didn't really know what to do at that point, right? And then, you know, from there to Rubicon, where we started in the cloud, right? And I think that aligns well with what you're talking, which is we wouldn't have been able to respond to the auction that started with RTB in 2010 and just took off like a hockey stick. And we were like, we have to get the capacity. So Amazon really was our savior at that point in time. And we built the business really quickly up to a level where we felt like, okay, this is getting really expensive. How do we do it, right? So then we started to build out our own data centers and migrate our services out of AWS. For us at that point in time, we were handling a lot of smaller transactions, but a lot of them, right? We did several trillions transactions per month, right? But we needed to keep it really tight, and we needed to keep it on the exchanges for telco. So we built like a very specialized infrastructure that could handle that and have a very, very small footprint. So that was very application specific workloads that we really knew well how to build, right? At Pinterest, it's you know, they started in the cloud. They, of course, in my view, is like a very large social aspect to it, which means that you need a lot of data, a little bit different maybe than Dropbox, but you need a lot of personalization, and you need a lot of those things in the back end. So we're more than 100 petabytes in the AWS at this point in time. So, same question comes to line as like, okay, should we stay in Amazon? Should we move out? What do you move out? How do you do it, right? So I think the last couple of years at Rubicon, I actually developed a hybrid cloud that basically were meant to go in and have this multi-connection to different cloud providers and be able to move things around. 2 years ago, that was a little bit early. I actually got kind of surprised. I still think that's kind of early because a lot of these providers, when it comes to like lots of data transfers, don't really know how to do like direct connects, and private peering is kind of cumbersome. So if you want to transfer a lot of data, you need to think about like how do you transfer that out? What is the cost structure? How much pipe do I need? How do I manage my data loads? Does it make sense? So.
That one to me is one thing we really want to touch on, which is in that transition or in that process of kind of transforming a business to go one direction or the other. Really, what are some of the key things you encounter? You mentioned the data mobility, right, and the kind of the efforts that are aligned there. What are the things that you might have encountered, Akhil, that your team struggled with or had to kind of learn through in that process?
I think there were 3 or 4 major things which we worried about. It started with, first of all, as you can imagine, Dropbox in the business of making sure your most private data is safe. So we had to build a very durable and reliable storage system. Sounds easy, but when you're talking about 500, 600 petabytes of data, that actually becomes a very hard problem. So we had to make sure that the system we are building is reliable, is well tested, and that took us a long time. The second one was to make sure the operational complexity, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize when you're running at scale. It is one thing to just build a system, but running itself is a lot of work. So we invested heavily in automation and making sure the operational overhead of running that system is actually as little possible. And the third one is what exactly Jan said, which is like how do we actually migrate. At that time, it was about 500, 600 petabytes of data from public cloud internally. So a lot of work had to go into building the pipes, the network to be able to do it, and that was a very big effort on our part.
So you mentioned automation, and I think you touched on it as well. I think when you kind of look at that transition, assuming there's a large install base of people actively using the cloud today and has a lot of automation resources kind of readily at their fingertips, when you start looking at hardware, what kind of key technologies or things have made it easier for you guys? Is it in-house? Is it new development teams? Is it things you've adopted and a combination of those? Kind of what's been the thing that changed that for your teams?
I think when I started in 2010, doing this kind of build-outs, we started with Puppet, and that was basically one of the foundations that a small team of 5 could manage like thousands and thousands of servers. At Pinterest, we also use Puppet. So one of the first things I did when we started to think about this was get the AWS Direct Connect and hook it up to SoftLayer and just prove that I can take workloads out and use the same automation tools that we do outside of AWS. So those problems become very complicated, and you can write as many white papers about how to solve that problem as you may, right? But once you try it, you realize some of the kinks that sometimes it's not that easy to solve, right? But you work through them, and then you have like a transparent workload that you can manage, right?
What about for you guys at Dropbox?
Yeah, so we had some advantage, as given that we were in hybrid infrastructure from the start. A lot of our tooling and abstraction that we have built were from day one designed with the idea of they may run on our infrastructure and AWS. But even then, to Rand's point, it turns out that you can have very good ideas about how everything should feel seamless. There are these rough edges that you have to take care of. Okay, this doesn't work the same in AWS. So we had to invest heavily in internal in-house tools, partly because of our scale. So our config management, our code deployment, everything at this point is mostly in-house built. Okay. But it was designed with the idea of that as a developer, you don't have to care whether it's in-house or it's in a public cloud. But it's not easy.
But I think networking is, that's kind of my biggest thing that I have is like, the way that we can use APIs today, but rarely do, because you basically have network teams that are very, they're focused on specific features, on specific CLIs, but you really want to get going on the API structure, right? And if you look like on tools like SnapRoute or others in that field, right? The matureness of those tools are not quite where you want them to be for things like BGP and other components that you're relying on, right? So network always is like one of these things that you actually have to invest a lot of effort in to get the automation to work.
Well, that to me is another interesting one, because if you look at the platform standpoint, you guys mentioned some of the new concerns and considerations, whether it's networking, whether it's config management, maybe it's even basic things like platform configuration. What are you doing at a BIOS level? What hard disk firmware do you have, and et cetera. What can the hardware manufacturers maybe do better, or what kind of problems have you encountered as you have to have a more granular view of the infrastructure that you're running? What things are, you mentioned a couple, for instance, improving the API programmability in the network layer. What might be a few of those others that you guys have struggled with or encountered over time?
I think one thing which was very refreshingly surprising for me was partners like Quanta were working very closely with our teams, and not just the hardware teams, but also working very closely with the software teams. So to me, the synergy of hardware and software teams, which in the past I always felt were two different organizations optimizing for different things, and they would just converge. So that partnership, understanding what complexity can move to software, and in order to build that complexity, what kind of APIs do we want to have on the hardware, what kind of management interfaces you want on the server, has been extremely valuable for us to be able to do what we have been doing. And that's the trend I see going forward, where the partnership with folks like Quanta will allow us to be able to say, okay, what kind of APIs and how can we make software manage your hardware and get the visibility. And you saw some of the stuff in the talks earlier where telemetry, managing your power, managing your CPUs, how can we do all of that in the software? And that requires close collaboration with the hardware vendors. And I think it's trending. I mean, I'm pleasantly very happy with how the trend is going in the industry.
What about skill set? So when you guys kind of look at it functionally, right, to me there's potentially a different skill set you'd find from a hardware developer, data center deployment, physical persona, and the developer API-centric kind of operational persona that John kind of mentioned before. So as you build that out, do you think things change in terms of the teams, or is it really just kind of adapting some of the same skills to a broader space?
So let's touch about the software stack.
Sure.
So if you look at like earlier at least, right, we had Cobbler, we had a lot of tools around automation that were based on text files, they were based on like multiple single points of failures, if you ask me. And then you look at more modern tools where you have databases, hierarchical structures, and you try to get queuing into your system. I still, in my opinion, is like we're not quite there yet where we actually have this easy ability to get into an infrastructure where everything is hierarchical, where everything is queues, where you don't have spikes on a network, and you have transparency between managing your switches and managing your nodes, and they are very similar to what you can do in Amazon. I think the people that comes the closest, at least to me, is like Canonical with their MOS infrastructure, because that one is actually it's kind of neat on how you have databases, how you have clean APIs. And then you can talk about Salt, and you can talk about other things. But it's getting there. But people like Facebook, I mean, they have advantages when it comes to like the life cycle management, things that they put into their infrastructure to manage these things. That they can have one person to 20,000. I think my rate is probably 1 to 5,000, right?
Yep.
So it's a little bit, we still have some distance to go to be in that sort of perfect world of mine, right? But
so if you take a step back and say, both of you are, with pretty strong shops that I think, invest a considerable amount of time in both the infrastructure and the resources to build that out. If you were, say, advisors for a smaller shop, maybe somebody who's incubating, got a great idea, bringing things off the ground, kind of what feedback would you give them both on what's going on today, what's going on in the future, how do they plan for growth effectively without maybe, having to revert things out later when they learn from what they experienced?
I think we all will agree here, and I think this is a point I stress whenever I meet people, which is that the disruption that's happening in infrastructure with the advent of public cloud and HCI is unprecedented. I personally feel the last time we saw this kind of disruption was when virtual machines became more of a mainstream idea. So starting with that, I think everyone I talk to, I tell them that you have to fundamentally think differently about infrastructure. You have to leverage the hybrid infrastructure and never be very principled about, I will always use the cloud or I will always use a private cloud. And that decision is very nuanced. Something we did internally at Dropbox when we chose to move our storage in-house, there are 3 questions that I tell people that they should ask themselves. One is, do you have the scale to be able to customize your infrastructure, which is possible when you have a larger scale, but becomes either too cost prohibitive or the initial cost is too high. The second one is, if you have the scale, do you have the capability, both in terms of people and the technology, to be able to customize your infrastructure in a way which is not possible or will be something that public cloud is not likely to do. In our case, it was the case because we felt that we could customize our storage needs compared to the public cloud offering. And the third one, which I think is very important, is that customization a real business add value? Like, is it just about the cost, or is it also something that enables you to do something that your end user values? So one of the reasons that we decided to move storage in-house was, by doing that, we could have this end-to-end optimization from all the way from hard drives to network. And one of the reasons that people love Dropbox is the reliability and the speed of sync. And by building those integrations, we were able to deliver 3x or 4x better performance than what the public cloud was able to do. I think in these three questions, the answers could be different for every company. But I think it's very important for everyone to understand the scale, the capability of customization. Because if you're just going to buy off-the-shelf racks, then your ability to deliver value may not be as high. It may just be about cost, and that's fine, but you should know that.
Gotcha. What do you think, John?
I think you need to be very careful when you start thinking about your cost structures, right? So, and the ability to move out of the cloud, right? So at Pinterest, I mean, one of the nice things is that nothing that we've done so far has been tying us into any AWS specific in terms of how we run our services. So it's fairly easy to move those outside. I think in terms of data, that's where the sort of the pudding lies, right? It's like you need to think about how you're going to manage your data. Most of the transits into a cloud is free, right? Taking them out is going to cost you money. So you need to think about where do I want my data? Because I mean, services, I think we can all agree that AWS and other clouds and upcoming clouds will have services that you want to use to bring your business forward very quickly, right? But in terms of what you do on your private side, I think the better, in my personal opinion, is like the things that we're going to see for 2017 coming out and where we're going with the hardware is going to be so interesting compared to what's going to be offered inside of the cloud. I think we're now in this sort of very homogeneous, there are some ups and some downs in terms of hardware, but I think we're moving towards a world that looks a little bit different when it comes to efficiency.
Right on, guys. Thank you very much. I think we'd hope to take a couple of questions, but we're literally done at this second. So thank you guys, and thank you both so much for joining.
Thanks, John.